Greetings, salams, and welcome to what is sadly our final episode of what has been a fascinating, enlightening, and of course, pioneering series of discussions with some of the world's greatest scholars and practitioners on the topic of empires, converts, and community, connecting with Britain's Muslim heritage. My name is Tariq Hussain, and I will be your host for one last time as we discuss influential and forgotten British Muslimahs, important Muslim heritage spaces, as well as how we might connect with them today. That's right, folks, we have saved our best theme for last. Today is not about British Muslim history. Today is all about Britain's Muslim her story, as we look at the lives of Britain's first Muslimahs. And as always, we have some amazing guests to do this. Firstly, Dr. Sariya, and I've always had trouble pronouncing the surname, so I'm going to give it a go, and you can always embarrass me afterwards. Cheruvallil-Contractor from Coventry University, who is working on a forthcoming book about Victorian female converts to Islam. I also have with me Gareth Winrow, historian and author of Whispers Across Continents, In Search of the Robinsons. And finally, Maulana Hamid Mahmood, a community historian and founder of the Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy. Thank you all for agreeing to be on the show today. Now, before we start, I will remind our viewers for the last time to post any questions you have in the chat area, and I will pick them up during the Q&A session at the end. So, Dr. Sariya, if I may start with you, please help us get to better know some of these women. Who were they and what were they like? And if we could have the first slide, please, Mijambe.
Thank you, Tariq. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and good afternoon. It's sunny outside, but we are inside because it's so exciting to explore these women. I first became interested in looking at British, the women in these communities over 3 or 4 years ago, because I realized that there was a lot being written about Quilliam and about Pickthall and about the men in these early British Muslim communities, and I'm talking turn of the 20th century, but hardly anything about the women. And so I decided I was going to explore this further. As a feminist scholar, that it was important that I uncover women's stories. Now, there are archives from the Liverpool Mosque. There are also archives and publications attached to the first mosque in Woking, the first purpose-built mosque. These archives are publications, journals. There are also newsletters, and I decided to trowel these to look at what were women saying, what were women doing, what were women being in those communities, and I came across women's narratives like the one on your screen now. This is from Jessie Amina Davidson. She's an early convert to Islam, and she's decided to announce her conversion in the publication coming from the Woking Mosque. And she says, "I'm happy to embrace the true, simple, sincere, natural faith of Islam." And you can read the rest of the quote on your screen.
And this was in the Islamic Review, is that right, Dr. Sariya?
Yes, this was in the Islamic Review, and you find both in the Islamic Review as well as in the Crescent that came out of the Liverpool Mosque, their community newsletter. You find people asserting their conversion, but also records, particularly in the Crescent, that says so and so person from XYZ address converted to Islam, and often these included women as well. So clearly, women existed in these communities. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, some of these women we know a lot about. Some of these women we don't know enough of, and I think there's a transition on this slide.
So can we click a couple more times, please, Mijambe? Because this is
one
of the more interesting one.
Thank
where we
you.
have poetry.
Yes. Now, the first piece of, so on the right hand side of your screen, what you will be able to see is a piece written by somebody called FEC. Now, FEC is none other than Fatima Elizabeth Cates and Maulana Hamid is going to tell us a lot about
Indeed.
her. But she writes this poetry to celebrate the achievements of Begum Shah Jahan of Bhopal, and she says, how can my feeble pen express? How can the poet praise thy noble acts of righteousness? Now these two women together, Begum Shah Jahan and Fatima Elizabeth Cates, through their lives demonstrate the centrality of women to the establishment of Islam in Britain. Begum Shah Jahan, as is commonly known, funded the Woking Mosque, which is the first purpose-built mosque. And Lady Fatima Elizabeth Cates was the first, one of the three founding trustees of the Liverpool Mosque. Together, we've got women at, playing a role in the establishment of the first two mosques. This is how significant women's contributions are. Now, in talking about these women and in getting to know them, I realized that, they were negotiating various forms of cultural, baggage, patriarchy on the one hand, that comes from perhaps forms of from some Muslim communities. I remember reading in the Crescent, there is this long exchange around, polygamous marriages in the Crescent and in the Islamic world. And there are questions being asked about, everybody sort of questioning these, particularly male scholars questioning the role of polygamous marriages. Not enough women's voices in there. But what these women were also negotiating were Victorian patriarchal attitudes. And there's this poetry in the middle of your screen, The New Woman, and it's all about this new woman who can study mathematics and quadratics and X, Y, Z, but it ends with she can't even sew a button to her little brother's pants. So the women, these women, who I'm going to explore, whose stories I'm very briefly going to tell you about, lived in these environments that had different cultural packages. So, for example, there was the debating society at the Liverpool Mosque, which was always called the Young Gentlemen's Debating Society, till a woman went and spoke at it. Interestingly, the woman didn't speak about Islam, she spoke about her favorite writer, Longfellow. So it's important to think about the context that these women were inhabiting. The next slide, please, Zanbhai. Now, this is a picture from an Eid Salah, early part of the 20th century. And you can see women at the back. Some of these women were were worshippers. They're sitting down on the musalla. Other women are observers. They were probably members of the local Woking community coming to observe and participate in the Eid celebrations. Now, look at what the women are wearing. None of them are really clothed, in quote unquote Islamic fashion.
Yes, it's the more kind of fashion of the time, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, it's not to say that they didn't wear Islamic fashion. There's this other really interesting story when the Shah, the prince, the Shahzada of Afghanistan, comes to visit England. He's coming to see the Queen. After seeing the Queen and visiting her and attending a party at Windsor Castle, he then moves on to Liverpool to meet the Sheikhul Islam of the British Isles. Now, at that point, because there was a foreign dignitary visiting, the Liverpool Muslimahs did actually wear hijabs. They wear it very much on their own terms. They talk about tweel hijabs and not lifting their hijabs in front of the married women, not lifting their face veils in front of the Shahzada, but unmarried women doing. This was more to cater for the Shahzada's sensibilities.
So it was more to kind of appreciate the cultural sensitivities of the visitor rather than their own kind of desire to wear this.
Yes, and there's this really interesting narrative captured in the Crescent and also in the Liverpool Echo, where one of these women, Nafisa Keep, who has a story of herself. She comes down from America, joins the Liverpool Muslim Institute, and is then giving these rallying speeches about women and women's rights in Islam. And we are talking about 1890s here. Wow. I mean, she engages with the audience, with people, because when the Shahzadas come to visit Liverpool, half of Liverpool's at the train station to get a glimpse of him. And they're also interested in getting a glimpse of they're Muslims, they're local Muslims, because word had gone out that the Liverpool Muslimahs and Muslim men who otherwise dressed normally in, as you can see, fashion of the times, were going to dress in Islamic gear. And this applied to both the men and women. And Nafisa Keep then has a very interesting exchange with these ordinary Liverpudlians saying, we're wearing this out of respect for our guest, and our faith does not, enforce anything upon us. Next slide, please, Ms. Andai.
And of course, one of these women, some of our viewers might just have heard of, because she was, as far as we know, Dr. Sariya, the first English woman to perform the Hajj. Isn't that right?
I know, and Lady Evelyn Cobbold's story is one of adventure, one of mystery, but one also of terrible privilege. So Lady Evelyn Cobbold was as upper class as it gets, aristocratic. Her mother was lady in waiting to the Queen. Now, and Lady Evelyn Cobbold in her early 20s converts to Islam, and there's a book that she's written, and in that she says, I don't really know when I converted to Islam. Perhaps I was always Muslim. She was brought up. Her father was a diplomat and lived in Egypt for a long time, and she was brought up by Egyptian nannies.
So she was exposed to Islam from a very early age, clearly.
Yes, and she says, I think she goes up to the Vatican or something, or somewhere to meet the Pope, and the Pope asks her about her faith, and that's when she actually felt she couldn't answer anything other than Islam, but stays quiet. So really fascinating story, very colorful, and we don't have time to go into it today. But what she is most notorious for is being perhaps one of the first British women, first European women, we don't know to have, because we don't have records for the time, but definitely one of the most earliest, the earliest woman to perform the Hajj, and possibly one of the very first women to do so in a motor car. So she goes from here on her own to Saudi Arabia by ship. She has friends because she's a travel writer and loves the Middle East. So she meets her friends along the way. In Saudi, she's the guest of, again, key Saudi diplomats. And she uses, so her son works for the Bank of England, I think the governor, I'm not fully sure. And she uses his, high position to negotiate access and permission to go to the Hajj. Now, what was really, and it's an amazing journey, because she goes there, she's during the Hajj, she's told to wear a full hijab, kind of the Afghani style, all encompassing veil.
There's a famous picture of it with the grill-like face covering.
Absolutely, and she's wearing it, and she does actually wear it for most of the Hajj rich rites, but as soon as the rites are over, she has to peel it off. It's just too hot, she says. It's also interesting how at one stage she's got this book with her, English book, novel, and an Arab sort of passing by questions, why is she reading an English book? And her driver gets really, really nervous. She says, hide it, say it's an Arabic book, and say it's the Quran. And she says, why should I? And she says quite loudly, I'm an English woman and I'm an English Muslim, and this is what we read. And the Arab accepts that. So she comes back from her Hajj, writes a book. The book is a bestseller, and is a record to date of this woman's, brilliance and this woman's confidence, both in performing the Hajj, but then writing a book about it, perhaps, one of the very first, best-selling introductions to Hajj. I'm going to stop there.
Yes, because the thing is, what's interesting about Lady Evelyn, of course, is that she, like you said, Dr. Sari, she's from a very privileged background, and clearly organizing the logistics of the Hajj, having her son's connections, made a massive impact and made it so much more easier for her to do this. Whereas Gareth, you have just published your new book about the Robinsons family, a legacy that really begins with an English girl from the other end of the social spectrum, which is very, very rare. She's from London's East End. Bethnal Green, actually, which, as you and I was discussing off screen, is where I grew up. So tell us about this particular individual, Gareth, if you can, please.
Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about what is, I think, quite an amazing and formidable woman. Hannah Rodda was born in Stepney, late 1854. Her mother's side of the family were bricklayers from Bethnal Green, the Russells, and they spent periods of time in the workhouse. So we are talking of people from really poor, impoverished backgrounds. Lived at 3 Colts Lane at one time, and then 8 Primrose Street. The father's side of the family, the Roddas, Hannah's mother was called Mary Ann Russell. Father was called Benjamin Rodda. The Roddas were from Cornwall. And again, a family not particularly wealthy. Benjamin Rodda was what we would call a merchant seaman. He died at sea in 1856 of tuberculosis, so when Hannah was very young, so she didn't really know her father at all. So coming from a very poor background, and I'm sure that she spent a period of time in the workhouse. Her mother did.
But the picture we've got, if I can just bring that up, sorry to cut you off there, Gareth, it's just because we're on the wrong picture. The picture shows the family in India. So Mijamba, if you can flick to the next slide, please. Keep going. Sorry. Yes, there. Sorry, Gareth, carry on. So we're still in Bethnal Green. Are you going to take us to...
We're moving on now. I'll move on quick. From Bethnal Green, the next I was able to find about Hannah was that she worked as a domestic maid for a Dr. Geoffrey Pearl. He was an interesting character. He was one of Queen Victoria's personal doctors. He was also at one time Mayor of Windsor. And it seems that Hannah had a child with Dr. Geoffrey Pearl, a legitimate child, not owned up to by Dr. Geoffrey Pearl, so you don't see it on the birth certificate, but in his will, he left a tremendous amount of money to a young girl, the daughter, Gertrude. So it's pretty obvious that Gertrude was the daughter of Hannah and Dr. Geoffrey Pearl. And Gertrude herself became famous as Gertrude Eisenman. She became a famous motor racing cyclist, car rally driver in Germany before the First World War. So sporting themes run throughout the family, as
we're going to find out.
So Gertrude Eisenman herself was quite a character.
But who's in this picture here, Gareth? Sorry.
Yeah, well, Hannah suddenly rises up in 1880 by chance. Somehow she marries Spencer Robinson, who is the gentleman on the far right of the photo, and Hannah is on the far left. So this photo, I think, is probably taken 1889 in India because of the age of the children there. The young man in the middle is a son from Spencer's first marriage, so he's not Hannah's child, but the other boys and girls are. And so basically Spencer Robinson was a tea planter. He'd been a tenant farmer from Lincolnshire. He was also a manager of the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway. So he was quite well known, quite high up. He helped the British in the expeditionary force in Sikkim in 1888. He was in charge of helping provide provisions. So this was a real rise up the social ladder for Hannah.
Indeed, yes.
But Spencer dies in 1889, and Hannah comes back to the UK with all the children in 1890 and sets up a upscale boarding house in Brighton. This is a place frequented by lords and ladies, aristocrats. So clearly Hannah is making use of the money, the legacy of Spencer, quite a successful tea planter. And it would seem that Hannah would live the rest of her life happily as a manager of this boarding hotel. But it didn't turn out to be the case.
No, and apparently her story is actually rather well known in Turkey. If we can go to the next slide, please, Mijamba, we will see that the version doing the rounds there, though, may not be wholly accurate. What we see here is a graphic novel. So firstly, how did Hannah end up in Turkey? What was her life like there, and how did this false narrative develop?
Okay. Hannah, by the way, is the rather glamorous-looking lady there in the diagrams, pictures. basically, this is a very interesting story. This is from a children's comic strip book. There are other versions of it in other books, basically saying that Hannah was not Hannah, but Sarah, or even Lady Sarah. Okay. And that came from a very educated family, and even linked with Cecil Rhodes in the news, obviously these days.
Yes.
Notice the surname Rodda and Rhodes, very similar. And so she converted to Islam, the story goes, with her husband, having seen the plight of the Muslims in India, and they converted to Islam and relocated to Constantinople. That is this sort of narrative which has been built up by the Turkish authorities, and partly one of their sons, Ahmet Robinson, is responsible for this.
Right. That's where this story potentially began with her son. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the son gave an interview shortly before his death to a Turkish magazine in 1965. Right. I think we have a slide on him if you want to show the football slide. Slide
is that the next 10. One?
No, number 10.
One after that, yes. So there we go, yes.
There he is. Yep. Ahmed Robinson, so he's one of the sons of Hannah, the goalkeeper, first goalkeeper for Galatasaray when they started to play in the Ottoman League. And this is, I think, the championship winning team, 1907 to 1908. So Ahmed Robinson, one of the sons, is a legend in Turkey. He introduced scouting, basketball to the Ottoman Empire, and other sporting achievements as Galatasaray's goalkeeper. Now, he was interviewed before his death in 1965, and basically, he told a lie there. He told this narrative about how his mother came from such a rich family, connected with the Rhodes, was highly educated. Why would he choose to do that? I try briefly in the book to explain that Ahmed Robinson was quite disillusioned by this time. He had left Turkey in the late 1920s to go to the United States. And I argued that was because of pressure from Turkish nationalists at the time, who were suspicious of his activities. He was even accused of being a spy at one time. And so he departed and went to the United States. And in that interview in 1965, that was shortly before his death. He knew he was dying. He had terminal lung cancer at the time. And I think that was one of his ways of trying to get his own back on the Turkish authorities, by saying how he came from such an important family. And people listened to that story because of the legend of Ahmet Robinson. He was so well known.
But how was it that the family ended up in Turkey?
Right, yeah. The family ended up in Turkey, in reality, because Hannah married what was thought to be an Afghan warlord who called himself Dr. Gulab Shah. And the couple, they met sometime in England in 1891 and were married at the mosque in Liverpool, November 1891, and relocated straight away to Constantinople. Dr. Gulab Shah turned out to be a fake. It was all in the newspapers, the marriage at the time, the Times had it, whatever. A famous...
So he wasn't an Afghan warlord after all?
The newspapers, they say he was the leader of the Ghazis in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. No, he was a charlatan, a well-known charlatan to the British Foreign Office. He was actually an Indian eye doctor, a quack Indian eye doctor, wasn't a very good Indian eye doctor. And he was basically trying to marry women for their money. And Hannah was one of his targets. And she was deceived by him. Very quickly, the marriage broke down in Constantinople in 1892. And the Sultan came to the rescue of Hannah. The Sultan, the Grand Vizier.
Why do you think the Sultan would come to the rescue of Hannah? I mean, what motivated that?
Two reasons. One, Hannah, there was a sort of Ottoman tradition of taking pity, giving welfare, refuge to women, especially who had converted to Islam. Hannah was known as Fatima of the English converts, so she got a bit of a reputation. And secondly, also because of the Quilliam connection in her letter.
There is apparently a curious allegation about Hannah's possible involvement with Abdullah Quilliam, with some sources suggesting that he may have even fathered one of her children. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, in the letter she wrote to the Grand Vizier, she said, "Oh, I know Quilliam," and etc., etc. And that, given that Quilliam was on the Sultan's radar at that time, seemed to do the trick. The argument goes that, according to various articles in the Ottoman archives and various Turkish historians, that Quilliam was actually the father of several of Hannah's children. Several, definitely one is referred to, Jacob Robinson, who died in the desert in the war, First World War in 1916. But Turkish historians have then said, so he was the father of the other children as well, which the dates and the locations just don't fit. I mean, those children were born in India in the 1880s. And as far as I know, Quilliam never set foot in India. But you can see how the story may be partly developed given Hannah's close contacts with Quilliam, the marriage in the mosque, etc., and the reports of the marriage in the Crescent, or Hannah's conversion to Islam is reported in the Crescent, and her meeting with Quilliam's wife. So there is quite a strong Quilliam-Hannah connection. Who knows? They may have had an affair at one time. I'm not disputing that, but there's no way that Quilliam was the father of Hannah's children. There's also another important connection. Can I briefly mention that with Quilliam?
Of course, yes, please do.
Because one of your earlier very interesting talks on Quilliam, we had you mentioned about how Quilliam lost his position as a barrister, solicitor in 1908. That was the case, the divorce case scandal of Martha May Thompson. Actually, Martha May Thompson, I saw in the archives, Foreign Office archives, in 1917, she addressed a letter to the Foreign Office saying, "Can you please tell me, is my fiance Ahmed Robinson safe? Do you know where he is?" So basically, Martha May Thompson was claiming that she was engaged to Ahmed Robinson, which again,
Hannah's son.
Yep, Hannah's son.
In the photo. Which
again seems to strengthen the Quilliam Hannah connection. And I suspect that when Quilliam went to Istanbul in 1908, Martha May Thompson was with him for a while and probably stayed with the Robinsons. I'm speculating, but that's quite possible. And that's where she may then have met Ahmed Robinson himself.
And we've also got in this picture here, of course, there's an Abdurrahman Robinson. Yeah. Do you want to just tell us about him and his other brother?
Yeah, Abdurrahman is also a famous sporting character, and he helped found the scouting movement as well with his brother Ahmed. Abdurrahman died on the Russian front in the First World War, so here he is in sort of military gear in 1915. And he's quite a legend as well. He is mentioned in that comic strip booklet. Because he had written a letter to his brother saying, "If I die, please make sure that Galatasaray always has a day to commemorate the dead of people who've died in the war." And as he died, that request was fulfilled. So now every 25th of June, the Galatasaray Sports Club commemorates its dead, and that is a consequence of martyrdom of Abdurrahman Robinson and fulfilling his wishes. So he is again also part of this legend, where there's quite a lot of truth within it.
So this commemorative event, does it still happen at Galatasaray to this day?
To this day, it still happens. Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. So we're going to come back to you at the end, Gareth, when we start looking at tangible ways in which we might connect with some of these characters still, because then we're going to talk a little bit more about Ahmed Robinson again. But I'd like to now go over to Maulana Hamid. I really wanted to bring you on as much to discuss the individual you have researched as your journey investigating her life. So tell me about that journey, but please start with how you found out about this person and what made you want to learn more. And if we could have the next slide to go with that, please, Mijambe.
Yeah, Jazakallah thank you for having me here. So just to start off with my journey into Fatima Elizabeth, it all started when I was at university. I was at Heathrow College studying Abrahamic religions, and Professor Ranjit, I think at that time, had written his book, and within a few weeks I bought the book and started reading, and I came across in the book Fatima Elizabeth Cates' conversion story into Islam. and what she went through. And just reading, and it was a story that she wrote herself, which was published in the Allahabad Review in, I think, the 1890s. And it was that story that I was really taken aback by, and the struggles she actually went through. And
what kind of struggles are we talking about? Sorry, Maulana.
Yeah, so just to give you a bit of context to her life, that she was born in 5th of January 1865 on at 59 Henry Street in Birkenhead. So she wasn't from Liverpool; she was from Birkenhead, and she spent most of her childhood there. Her father, John Murray, had migrated from Ireland. He was a market porter at the newly built and flourishing Birkenhead market. And when Frances turns about 6, she's been described as a scholar in an 1871 census, which simply meant that she either attended school or she had regular, schooling taking place. Mm-hmm. And I think that was somewhat influenced by the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which may have played a role in her being at school. And again, her brothers, she looks up to them because her father at this stage passes away. He's no longer the head in any of the censuses thereon. Her elder brother, David, he worked as a riveter, and William's occupation was described as a timekeeper. She had 3 other sisters. And then her mother, Agnes, she marries a Mr. Peter Cottam. And through this union, they were blessed with a daughter called Clara, who later on becomes Halima at one point from, just through inspiration of Fatima Elizabeth, her elder sister. However, coming to the point about how she comes into Islam, how she learns about Islam, we move over to 1887. And it's across the River Mersey. Liverpool was being described as the most, and I'm quoting a newspaper article, Liverpool was being described as the most drunken, the most criminal, the most pauper oppressed, and the most death-stricken town in England. And obviously, Fatima Elizabeth at the time, or Frances Elizabeth Murray at the time, she was taken aback by all of this. And she was part of the teetotal temperance movement at the time. And this movement was basically focusing on how to eradicate alcohol or get people to abstain from alcohol. And Fatima Elizabeth, or Frances at the time, was an advocate for teetotalism and regularly attended temperance meetings under the Birkenhead Workingmen's Temperance Association. And she was also connected to the Good Templar Order in Cheshire. And it was there, when coming to her conversion and where she learns about Islam, it's there that Frances heard about a Mr. Quilliam. And more recently, a lecture that he had given under the auspices of a society called the Liverpool Temperance League at Vernon Hall in Liverpool. Mr. Right. Quilliam his next lecture was Fanatics and Fanaticism. You can see it's been, transformed into a kind of booklet as well. And you can see that picture on the slide.
Which has disappeared. Can we have the slide back up, please, Mijambe, where we'll see the actual lecture that was turned into a booklet?
Yeah.
But carry on, Maulana.
Yeah, sure. So that lecture was entitled Fanatics and Fanaticism. So that was the week before. But the week after, the same lecture was planned at the Birkenhead Workingmen's Temperance Association in the Queen's Hall in Birkenhead, so across the river. And Frances Murray attended the lecture to learn more about abstinence from alcohol, not knowing what Abdullah Quilliam was doing. So Abdullah Quilliam started the talk by mentioning the names of well-known specialists in the spheres of invention and social reform, like Stevenson, the inventor of steam power, and Wilberforce, the campaigner against slavery. And he kept on going until he comes and begins to talk about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And I'm just going to quote what Quilliam said, just to give you an idea. And you can also read this further in Fanatics and Fanaticism. He says that this master reformer came with a clear message inviting people to what is good and beneficial. In spite of this, he had to face harm and persecution, just like any other great reformer who had been dedicated to the welfare of people. Now, by this and by this lecture in general, so Frances at the time, she was taken aback by 2 things. One was that she learned that Muslims were teetotalers, so they were totally abstaining from alcohol, something that she believed in at the time. So she took that to heart. But at the same time, and remember, she's 19 years old at this time. So already she's engaged with all these discussions that are taking place. So after the lecture, she approaches Abdullah Quilliam and she asks him, and I quote her, she says, isn't it true that the Muslim prophet said that women do not have souls and will not enter paradise?
Wow.
And
So this was an actual discussion that took place.
yeah, so she spoke to Quilliam after the lecture, and because those were the things that were taking place by the Orientalists and their writing about Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and this was the propaganda that was being spread at the time. So Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, he replied, no, and don't believe what I say or what anyone else says, study the matter for yourself. And just to make it very brief, he then at some point gives her his own copy of the Quran, which she then takes home, and there's an exchange of letters between Fatima Elizabeth or Frances Elizabeth at the time and Abdullah Quilliam, which then portions of which come into the faith of Islam, which is the other picture that you have on the same slide, and which also ultimately gets Queen Victoria, who's a queen at the time, she gets a copy of that book as well.
The red one.
The red one, yeah, that's right. And then Frances at that time, she takes home the book, the Quran, and then she's an avid reader. She reads quite a lot, and her mother at this point asks her, so what book do you have today? And she says, this is the Mohammedan Bible. And as soon as she hears that, her mother runs towards her and says, get this book out of my house at once. Wow. And Fatima Elizabeth replies, how can I know if it's an evil book if I haven't read the contents yet? And she runs into her room, locks herself in, and her mother Agnes runs after her, trying to take her out. And even within her house, there are a lot of restrictions. Her letters are intercepted. She's locked in her room many a time. She can't go out. If she does go out, it can only be with the Quran in her hand. Otherwise, it will be destroyed. And this is Fatima Elizabeth describing her own conversion, which appears in the Allahabad Review. So,
right. So this narrative you've just told us, this was written. Was it written by Fatima herself?
That's right. Yeah, this was written by Fatima Elizabeth herself, which came in the Allahabad Review, but was also reprinted in one of the sections of the Crescent as well. Right. And I think it was also reprinted after a few days after she passed away in the December 1900 Crescent as well. And not only that, that was just the beginning. I mean, the neighbors found out, and there were actually cases where she would come across from Birkenhead and actually would enter and come close to them on the street where they were meeting up in a very small room. Just as she would get surrounded by men at the time, and they would throw vegetables and garbage and also horse manure. They would gather, pin her down, and wipe it all over her face and all over her clothes. So these are, early instances of Islamophobia that were taking place at the time. Yeah. And, also being in her and anyone else who entered, and like Dr. Sariya was saying, there were the three alongside Abdullah Quilliam. She was one of them who would attend such a meeting. I mean, it just goes to show her courage at the time, being a woman in, early Victorian Britain. She was doing all that for something that she believed in. And all this because, Frances had now become Fatima, and she had accepted Islam and repeated the kalima after Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam in July of 1887. So
she must be such a brave individual. As you say, this is, patriarchal Victorian society. She's just a young girl. She's getting all this abuse, and yet she remains steadfast. And I imagine that's what it is that really inspired you about her story.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we see a difference in comparison to Lady Zainab Evelyn Cobbold. Because she's coming from a very ordinary background, and a background that I think most Muslims here today can relate to. And not only that, the struggles that she is going through and facing, and then it doesn't kind of impact her that she leaves the faith. She continues till her last breath, even where she has Abdullah Quilliam's hand in her hand, and she says the kalima out aloud, and then she passes away, which I'll come to in a few minutes. But just a few things I wanted to add, if that's okay.
Please, carry on.
So moving on to some more areas of her life. In 1889, it wasn't long, before the first Mosque of England was established at 8 Brougham Terrace and West Derby Road in Liverpool in 1889, with Fatima Elizabeth Cates as the first treasurer. So she was the first treasurer and a female, as Dr. Sariya mentioned, of the Liverpool Muslim Institute. And it was also the same year that she got married to, and if you can go to the next slide, she got married to a Mr. Hubert Hashim or Halim Cates on the 28th of February. She was officially married, and I don't think there were any marriages taking place at the Institute because it was fairly new. So she was officially married at the Cathedral Church of St. Peter's in Liverpool in the presence of Halliday Holmes and Julia Gibbons. Now, Hubert Halim
So
Cates,
even at this point, she is Muslim at this point, obviously.
Yes, absolutely, she is Muslim.
But she's getting married at the church.
That's right, yeah, that's right. So Hubert Halim Cates, her husband, initially he was unfavorable towards her conversion, and this is prior to their marriage, not after them. And by that stage, Hubert himself becomes a Muslim. He was inspired by Fatima's unwavering passion that he saw burning within her to this new faith. And just to add, the Cathedral Church of St. Peter's is no longer there. It's actually become part of a shopping complex, and I think the next is where the church is now, unfortunately. However, moving over to 1890 and 1891 and 92, those are the 2-3 years where we see a lot happening in terms of Fatima Elizabeth and her outreach when it comes to Islam and preaching Islam. And I just want to shed a few bits there before we just move over to the end of her death and what happens and what leads to it. So in 1890, Fatima Elizabeth Cates now, she writes a paper for the Liverpool Muslim Institute, but it's not clear whether it was also a lecture delivered at the Institute, but she did write a paper on the folly of heeding scandal. So this was actually only printed in the Crescent after her death. So it was basically after her death, they must have seen that lecture and reprinted it in the Crescent. But it was in 1890 that it was written, and also in the same year, and I believe it was in 1st of November in 1890.
We've got this stuff on the next slide, haven't we, Maulana? Just so
yes. If you go to the next slide,
bring up the next slide, and it will see some of these references. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. So, in the Glasgow Herald in November 1st of 1890, there's kind of a reference to her writing letters to ulama in India. And I think it's Gareth's book that kind of that mentions that it was to Maulana Hassan Ali right. that she wrote letters to. And it was basically seeking for advice and help and assistance in terms of propagating Islam here in England. And then we move over to 1891, and that's where her conversion story is being written and printed in the Allahabad Review, alongside her poem, another poem, which she called A Muslimah's Prayer. And it kind of summarizes, and she was writing this when she was living at number 2 Marmaduke Street in Liverpool, which is not so far from the LMI. And I'd like to read out her poem. It kind of summarizes, her entire life and the struggle she goes through, which we shall talk about now as well. So her poem goes, it says, A Muslimah's Prayer. Beset by numerous foes, concealed along the way, we must those enemies oppose, and ever work and pray. They watch but to devour, like ravening beasts of prey. If we in an unguarded hour but cease to work and pray, then may we ever heed the warning God has given, that so we may in safety tread the road that leads to heaven. This was by Fatima Elizabeth Cates when she was living at number 2 Marmaduke Street in Liverpool. So this kind of summarizes her life. There's and during that same year, there was this interesting development in the Liverpool Mercury, and there was a column which was started by a female lecturer who gives herself a pen name Esperanza. And she starts this topic on the marriage question. And she starts this discussion on whether marriage as an institution in the Christian context, whether it's a failure or a success in, at that time, Victorian era. And she begins a discussion and she brings up various incidents that take place before. I'm not going to go too much in detail. Mm-hmm. But at one point, so what happens is every day or every other day, someone responds to Esperanza, Esperanza responds to them. So either they're against her or they're, talking.
This is all in one of the newspapers, right?
This is in quite a number of newspapers, in one newspaper, but over a number of days, over about a month.
Indeed. So
what
it's
happens?
an old-fashioned forum, in other words.
Yeah, or an old-fashioned Facebook
Yes.
post, right? So,
Exactly.
so what happens is, in one of the posts, Esperanza is refuting another person, and in doing so, she states that so-and-so person should join the new Mohammedan cause now started in Liverpool because of how backward her ideas are about marriage. So after Esperanza says that, that catches the eyes of Fatima Elizabeth Cates. And then she writes a column responding to her, which is quite long, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing.
Mhm.
But just towards the end, where Fatima Elizabeth, she mentions, and she kind of, the following day, she sends in another request to change a bit of what she had already mentioned. So what Fatima Elizabeth says is, in regards to marriage and how, you know, the place of love in marriage, and, you know, in terms of the Christian marriage institution, she writes, so Fatima Elizabeth responds to Esperanza towards the end and says, what is required to remedy this evil is to at once and forever get rid of the notion that marriage is in any way bound up with religion. So this is what Fatima Elizabeth writes. She later corrects that in the following day's column. And then she says, and to regard it solely and wholly as a civil contract between two parties entered into with their mutual consent. And then Fatima Elizabeth, the following day, and then the date she gives is the Islamic date, which was the 6th of Ramadan, 1306. And what she kind of changes that to is what is required to remedy this evil is to regard marriage solely and wholly as a civil contract between two parties entered into with their mutual consent, and which by the like mutual consent can also be dissolved. So Fatima Elizabeth is talking about marriage,
Divorce.
but also divorce at this
Right.
point. And it's interesting to note that it's only about 8 months after this that Fatima Elizabeth writes up and signs her own divorce petition against her husband, Hubert Henry Cates, in December of the same year. And while she was writing all of this in the newspaper, she was going through a lot of domestic abuse, and that comes in, you know, physical, verbal, mental, in every way possible. And she describes this over 18 pages of her divorce petition. And it's interesting that, you know, this is in 1891, and she's going through this, but then she continues her, her faith, and not only continues it, but continues to propagate her faith and learn about her faith as much as possible.
And defend it, apparently.
And defend it, absolutely. And she goes on the following year with Abdullah Quilliam on a train journey to Manchester to meet some Egyptians who had come over. And then, you know, she's described as Fatima and as the earliest Muslim converts in that discussion. But what happens then in October of 1892 is she travels abroad aboard the ship Anubis to Alexandria in Egypt. And alongside her, two other Muslimahs, and there's only mention of these three Muslimahs, okay? One is Amina Mukaish.
We've got that, sorry, we've got that ticket. So if we can bring that up.
Yep.
Next slide, please, Mijambe. We'll see. There she is. Is that the actual ticket?
So that's not the ticket. That's actually it used to be the register for everyone who was on board the ship, not the passengers, but those who were working aboard the ship. So it was a register for them with their names and, you know, procedures and policies. So this is the register that I found, which which on the date that Fatima Elizabeth went, which is October, and she travelled on board Anubis. Anubis used to go up to Egypt and bring back lots of cotton. The furthest it would travel would be Cyprus. So between Alexandria and Cyprus, but most likely what I found in most of the newspapers at the time, that Anubis was going in those days to Alexandria, and then from there, you know, getting lots of cotton and coming back to Liverpool. So Fatima Elizabeth, she's on board this ship with two other Muslims, Amina Mukaish being one of them, and Al Zuleika Banks being the other. And the newspaper describes them as, they were there to visit various Eastern Muslim cities. But we can't really, we're not clear as to which cities they were.
Do we not know much about this journey, this expedition they go on?
Not yet, because we just recently found out about this, and I think it was just a couple of weeks ago that I found that piece there as well that you have. But it was in May 1893 that Fatima Elizabeth returns to Liverpool, because it comes up on one of the points in the Crescent, where they mention that, oh, Fatima Elizabeth has returned from her journey abroad, and that's all it mentions.
Right.
And then so in 18, so she was out there for about 5 to 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to kind of find and trace what she was doing in Egypt. And maybe there might be some kind of link to the gentlemen who she went to visit in Manchester, who were there, who had come as visitors from Egypt.
So you're suggesting that maybe that's one of the reasons they headed there, because of the people she had met when she went,
and maybe heard stories about it. But at this stage, it's just an assumption that we can
No, of course, it's a speculation.
Absolutely.
Just talking of speculations, was there ever any kind of doubt cast on her relationship with Quilliam at all at any point?
And this is the point I'm going to come to now, because what happens in 1895 in January, her husband Hubert Cates. So what we find out from this and passages in the Crescent, that despite her signing off the divorce petition, I don't think it went ahead. They still somehow stayed together, maybe known to the wider community at the time. But in January of 1895 in the Crescent, it has a piece which describes her husband as passing away suddenly at sea. And the same date, January 1895, which I've searched, and comes up on his death certificate as well. So he passed away of a heart attack on board a ship, because he was a marine engineer. So you can expect that. And so he passes away, and then Fatima Elizabeth is mentioned again in the Crescent in May of 1896, the following year, gifting some books to the LMI library, which included The Merchant of Venice. And this is the last time that I've come across Fatima being mentioned in the Crescent, all the way up until her death in October 1900. Now, so what's happened to Fatima from 1896?
4 years.
Yes, to 4 years up to 19, when she was such an active member of the community at the time. So we gain a bit more when it comes to this point, in terms of finding out what she was doing, where she was, because she's no longer visible in the Crescent.
Right.
When she passes away in October 1900, right, she's then mentioned in the Crescent. Okay, she's mentioned in the Crescent, and she's also mentioned with a son, okay, Hubert Halim Quilliam Cates.
Yes.
And I managed to get hold of his birth certificate. He was born on the 19th of May, 1896. So that was a couple of weeks after she had gifted a few books to the library. But there's no mention of her son in the Crescent at all.
Right.
And she and just to come to the point about when I went out to find her grave, why I was finding it a challenge, because obviously when we're doing searches, we're looking for her surname and her name being spelled as Cates, C-A-T-E-S.
Mm-hmm.
But then I couldn't find it. I was looking for it for about a year. So then I actually went to Liverpool, into the Liverpool archives, and then because we had the exact date and we knew which cemetery it was much easier for us to find it. And then we, alhamdulillah, we found the actual death registry with Quilliam there as well. But Fatima.
When you say Quilliam there as well, what do you mean?
He was the person who was signing off all the papers for her.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was, like, you can say that he was the imam, performing the janazah, the funeral as well. So with her spelling was Frances Elizabeth Cates with a K. So it's K-A-I-T-Z. So when I asked the historians at the archives, they were saying, maybe the Victorians just didn't know how to spell her name, or they just spelled it how they heard it. But then later on, I believe that was not the case, because with that spelling, Frances Elizabeth Cates comes up in the Gauze directory with all the addresses and people living in the addresses. She comes up as Frances Cates with a K, A-I-T-Z, or Fanny Cates, which was also her name in the 1881 census. Right. So she comes up in West Kirby, living there. And this kind of correlates with the story in the Crescent in 1900, that she had moved there. Again, similar to, I think, Hannah, that she had her own boarding house where people would come and she'd rent out the rooms, and she would take care of her child, Hubert Halim Cates. Now, coming back to your question, in regards to where Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam comes into all of this, you can imagine Fatima Elizabeth her husband passes away. So her source of income is finished, right? And they're not from the upper class, and they're from somewhat of the middle working class, and she no longer has any source and form of income. Now, if you look at the Crescent in the 1895 January pages, Hubert Cates is described as passed away. So Hubert Cates passes away in January of 1895, and Fatima Elizabeth Cates' son, Halim Quilliam Cates, is born in May 1896. So that's 15 months after Hubert Cates' death.
Yes.
So it's clear pretty much that Hubert Cates was not the father of Halim Quilliam Cates. Now, if you look at Halim's birth certificate, it actually has Quilliam as his surname. So what is a probable interpretation of this is, and at the same time, the Muslims believing at the time in polygamous marriages, was perhaps that Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam may have had a nikah with Fatima Elizabeth Cates. And it was difficult for Fatima Elizabeth Cates to continue. I mean, she couldn't return back to her family because her mother Agnes was so much opposed to her conversion already. So she had nothing, in terms of going back to there. So this is where I'm thinking, Fatima Elizabeth Cates is a widow. She has nowhere to go at the time. And Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam has a nikah with her, which the wider community are not aware of. And hence,
because of the bigamy laws at the time,
absolutely,
it was something they couldn't make public.
Yes, absolutely. And therefore, not only that, that's where Fatima Elizabeth disappears from the Crescent and from the scene. And then she comes up in places in like the Boers directory as Frances Cates with a K, ending with a Z, and also Fanny Cates. So they're reverting our identity back to prior to Islam, and then she moves there. But this is a probability at this stage. Just
to make that clear, it is obviously yourself and others connecting dots, but we don't necessarily have any hard evidence to say that they were married Islamically or otherwise.
Yes, absolutely. And just to add on to that it was a few months after her death that Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, he auctions 50 paintings and watercolors that belonged to Fatima Elizabeth Cates by famous artists, and this advert comes up in so many papers around Birkenhead and West Kirby, and he's responsible for her inheritance as well. So and just to add, and after she passes away, in the Crescent, the comparison between Quilliam and Fatima is given in terms of, as a metaphor of the comparison between the Prophet ﷺ and Khadija radiallahu anha.
Okay,
which is quite interesting.
It's making that parallel of them also potentially being married.
Yes, and just to add, so this is what the Crescent mentions after her death. It says that her work in connection with the mosque was too well known for there to be any need for him to dwell upon it. And he could almost say of her, as the Prophet said of Khadija, she believed in me and the faith when all the world was against me. Therefore, he mourned her as a dear sister now departed. But there is a conscious effort within the Crescent of hiding the fact that she had a son from anyone else, because when they talk about her husband's death, after Fatima Elizabeth's death, they changed the date to January 1896. Whereas if you go back to the 1895 January, it's already there. So they have kind of brought
essentially
the
what you're saying is maybe this was to avoid any kind of scandal.
Yes, that's right. But I mean, going back to polygamy and Islam, I mean, it's there, and he believed in it, and they might have practiced it. That's what's said. And I would like to just finish off on the very last few moments of her death, if I can.
And if we can, I mean, seeing as you're talking about her death, yes, we can see here that you did actually eventually find Fatima's final resting place there in Liverpool. Is that a church graveyard? Just before you tell us how.
So that's basically a cemetery in Anfield. It's massive. I mean, it's near the Liverpool football stadium.
That would be the Premier League Champions football stadium.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and and if you look on Google Maps, it's about 5 times the size of the Liverpool FC stadium. 5 times the size. So to find her grave was a big challenge, but we did manage to look at the archives, and we kind of noted it down to the exact points before we actually ventured out. And then we went to, there's an interesting anecdote to this. When I was in the Liverpool archives, there was a local historian there, and she took me into a room where there was this like documents of these of this couple who actually made it their mission to go to every single grave and note down what was written on the gravestones, like about 50 years ago. And they went to every single grave and they numbered it as well. And from her death registry, we knew that her grave number was 418. When we looked at those documents, we didn't find anything on 418. So what happened was I moved on to, so we found 416, which was clearly described as a gravestone that was lying flat on its face. So we were able to find that first and then locate Fatima Elizabeth's grave, because it's a grave without any tombstone at the moment. Right.
So yeah. And that's you obviously in front of the grave. But just to finish, can we go to the next slide? Because obviously you've named your academy after Fatima Elizabeth, and I understand that's the logo.
That's right, yeah.
And I know we've spoken about the whole Quilliam connection, but I think it would be good to end on what it was that made you want to use this forgotten woman's name, this amazing woman who was let's be blunt about this, the first treasurer of a mosque in the UK was this woman.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, her conversion story, the struggles that she went through, and not only her struggles that she persevered through those struggles of every type and form, and which she describes in her, poem as well. And that continues all the way till her death. And, and I'll just mention a few lines of a moment of her death before I come back to this.
Sure.
It's from the Crescent. It says, "A few moments before she died, our sister raised the index finger of her right hand and slowly but clearly repeated the kalima in Arabic. Then putting her hand in that of the sheikh, she smiled a sweet smile and said, 'Goodbye, it is all over,' and without a struggle, peacefully yielded up her breath." So it's her struggle all the way till her last breath, and she continues. And not only that, she ultimately becomes a Muslim after having read the Quran in English. So there's that inspiration as well, that having read the Quran so deeply that she in turn decides to accept Islam. And that's what we do at our, at our madrasa, where we have students, but they also, look at the Quran. We're fully much engaged with the Quran in English. And in one of the major inspiration is Fatima Elizabeth. But it's not only a madrasa, we have different projects that are related to it, and especially our Fatima Elizabeth Institute of Islam, Science and Philosophy. And that's where we can come back to the mosque and what was going on in terms of the lectures in science and evolution. And that's something that we have taken on. And we have over about 20 members who are professors from various universities all over the world, and which is headed by Dr. Shuaib Ahmed Malik at the moment. And we had a conference last year, which is available on YouTube. It's a 5-hour lecture on Islam and evolution. So we're looking back at those times and being inspired by the kind of things that they were doing at the time for the people and how they were promoting Islam. And just to add, when Abdullah Quilliam, when he gave his lecture on evolution, out of that lecture on evolution, he said how Christian theology could, it was a challenge for Christian theology, whereas it wasn't for Muslim theology. And out of that lecture, Abdullah Quilliam had another convert. So he's talking about evolution, and people were accepting Islam at the time. So that was what was going on at the time. And just to finally add to that, we have a choir, we have a scouts group named under Fatima Elizabeth, a cycling group, which is a nationwide recognized cycling group, and we're now starting an archery club as well. So we want this to be as holistic as possible, and we want to approach Islam in the most beautiful forms as possible.
That is fantastic, Maulana, and it's wonderful to see that this kind of individual is inspiring our modern institutes and clearly inspiring individuals like yourself. Now, I'm conscious that lots of questions are coming in, so I do have a couple more slides that I just want to get through. So if we just pull up the next one, whilst we had to head to Liverpool for Fatima, one of the things Gareth tracked down is where Hannah used to live in Istanbul. Can you just quickly tell us about this picture on the next slide here? I mean, on this slide here, please.
Yes, this is the street running up. I don't know, people, if they've been to Istanbul, this is the street running up from Beşiktaş near the Dolmabahce Palace, going up towards the Nişantaşı. And this is the street number 107 on the Karetla, was a place where Hannah definitely lived in the early 1900s. And she was one of the only 2 people to have rent-free accommodation on that very prestigious row. This is a row where diplomats were living. The modern picture you have there, the W Hotel, that was the address of the only other person at the time who had rent-free accommodation, and that was Fausto Zanaro, the court painter for Sultan Ahmed Abdulhamid II. There's one quick story on that. In 1907, Hannah got a letter from the Ministry of Finance saying, you have back payments. You owe us over 90,000 kurush and we demand immediate payment. Hannah sent in a petition and said, no, no, no. This was a rent-free accommodation arrangement with the Sultan himself. And I have the letter from the Minister of Finance himself personally apologizing to Hannah. You're correct. Very sorry. We shouldn't have demanded the payment. We're talking of quite a formidable woman who makes sure that she gets her way.
That's fantastic, Gareth. And I also understand that you are aiming to locate the final resting place of Hannah's famous Galatasaray son as well. So if you do, get hold of that, people, you should definitely follow Gareth on Twitter and all the other kind of ways in which we connect these days. But I'm going to move on now because our final 2 slides allow me to bring back in Dr. Sariya because they are both linked to Lady Zainab. The first is her grave site where exactly is this, Dr. Sariya? And why there? Do you know?
Yeah, so I've actually driven past. It's high up in the hills, beyond the Highlands, beyond Inverness, up in the very north of Scotland. You can't get there without hiking boots and an off-roader. And we tried to get there, but I have a 2-year-old and I decided not to. My daughter was, a year and a half actually, and I decided not to walk up there. But Lady Evelyn Cobbold, there's a picture I showed you previously of her with her, deer hunting gear and hunting deers. But she, after, in her later years, she shunned, London and the Mayfair fashion and preferred very much to live in her hunting lodge up in, Gleneth in these highlands, and when she died, she chose to be buried there, and that's an image of her grave. Hopefully when my daughter's older and can walk up a mountain, we'll go there together. And this is again very interesting narrative captured in the Islamic Review now, and in the archives of the Woking Mosque, how they received a call that a Muslim lady has passed away, and please can you send, her family calls up, and please can you send an imam? And the imam says, back then getting to, Inverness from Woking was hard, but he gets there, he does the janaza, he talks about, how different it was because he was possibly the only Muslim, but he does confirm that we buried her with all the Islamic rites and with her face, facing Makkah. And, there's that image Hamid shared of him at Lady Fatima's grave. And that was the path I followed as well, because in following these women's stories, and indeed these men's, visiting their graves brings a bit of completion. There are women whose stories we've uncovered now. So, we've talked about Lady Evelyn Cobbold, Fatima Cates, Hannah Robinson. There are so many other women whose stories we don't know enough of, and that's a personal passion for me to encourage scholarship, not just my own, to uncover these stories. The next slide is
if we could just bring the next slide up, please. And what we see here, of course, is that we've got a modern cover of Lady Evelyn's pilgrimage to Makkah, which was published by Arabian Publishing Limited, but it's very difficult to get hold of. I couldn't find any online. And then, of course, we've got historic edition, the original there. And some of these first editions are actually available still online to purchase for anyone who wants a bit of British Muslim heritage, shall we say. But as you can see, the price isn't cheap. And some of them are, in fact, signed as well by the author.
And a little story about the old edition. So it was originally published with a dust cover, and on the dust cover they had Lady Evelyn Cobbold's photo in the full sort of veil, completely covered, because that was deemed more appropriate at that time by her Muslim collaborators. But I went to see her great-great-grandson in London, and they have lots of resources. They've kept everything that belonged to her. And that also showed me the humanity of these historical personalities, because I got to hold a pony, a silver little cup she won in the pony races when she was 11 years old. But what I also got to hold was this really old version of the book that she owned, and I removed the dust cover. And then engraved on the actual hard copy was her name in Arabic, Zainab, as you can see. And that was on one level hidden, and it brought to me a sense of connection that I've felt at Lady Fatima Cates' grave. I felt it in the hills in Scotland, but I felt it holding this book, vulnerability, despite all her privilege, all her prestige. She was vulnerable in that her Muslim name is hidden under the dust cover. But these are really, really powerful stories of women. And these stories lend to a different telling of British Muslim history. A telling that is her story, like you alluded to. A story that is contentious. There are different versions. We've got so much more to uncover, so many women whose stories we don't know enough about. But it's a story that inherently places us, all of us, here. So rather than looking to the Middle East or South Asia or wherever, we look here. And to conclude, and I am concluding, I just want to show you the power and the relevance of these women. So I mentioned Nafisa Keep to you earlier on, and her defense of, Islamic norms around women. And she wrote a piece that was published in the Crescent and in the Islamic Review. And I'm only going to read a couple of excerpts, and then hopefully you'll immediately see why these women are relevant. So she writes, under Islamic law, as we will be shown in detail hereafter, a woman occupies a superior legal position to that of her English sister. She continues, she is entitled to a share in the inheritance of her parents along with her brothers, although the proportion is different. She continues, on her marriage, she does not lose her individuality. She does not cease to be a separate member of society, and her existence does not merge in that of her husband. Now, this debate that Nafisa Keep is alluding to over 100 years ago is still a debate that scholars like myself have to still engage with around Islam and gender in contemporary Britain. So it is imperative we uncover these women's stories. They were products of a different societal, historic context, but nevertheless, their stories remain relevant and offer lessons we can learn from.
And on that fantastic note, Dr. Sariya, we're going to have to go to questions. Okay, so let me start. Well, we've got one here that I can actually answer. Molly is asking, where is this madrasa? And I think if we can go to, I think this question was popped up when Maulana, you were speaking. So where is your madrasa?
It's in Walthamstow, East London.
Fantastic. Okay, that's a nice quick one. Now we've got one from Lynn. And again, it's probably best directed at you, Maulana. She's interested that the Liverpool newspaper column is written by Esperanza. Oscar Wilde's mother used the name Esperanza when writing, and I wonder if this is the same person.
We can't be sure of that because it doesn't actually mention her actual name. It just describes her as a female lecturer at one point over various conversations. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just going to quickly scroll up, and I can't actually see any more questions coming in. If they do, I will come back to them. But really and truly, well, that's pretty much it, folks, But please don't log out just yet. Oh, I've just had a question come in as soon as I said that. So from Shahanara. So this says, I'm still not, oh, this is just saying that the slide was stuck. Okay, so this is from Yahya Burt. Can we put up the other picture of Hannah when she was older? We only saw it briefly. And when that picture comes up, so that's the picture which has a bit of writing scribbled on it, handwritten scribblings on it. And when that comes up, is there anything, go down. Yeah, is there anything Gareth can say about Hannah Fatima's life in Ottoman Istanbul? So it's 2 slides down from the one you're on, Mijan Bey, the one with the beige kind of framing.
It's number 9.
Yeah, number 9. That one, there we go. So if you can put that on the screen, and then Gareth, if you can tell us anything about Hannah Fatima's life in Ottoman Istanbul, please.
Yes, as I said, we don't know that much. There's the encounter with the Minister of Finance, as I mentioned, on the Karet La. There's also, as mentioned in the Crescent, when Quilliam visited Constantinople in 1898, Hannah was part of the reception committee with all her family. And when Quilliam departed in 1898, Hannah's new husband, her father-in-law, Hannah's new husband was a colonel in the Ottoman army, Ahmed Bari, and his father was in the ceremony handed over to Quilliam a picture which had quotations from the Quran, and this is part of a sort of ceremony as the Quilliams went off, I think, to Izmir. So Hannah was quite a celebrity for a while there in the late 1890s. I think that as her sons became more famous, she sort of receded more into the background. And I do have a few letters from her on her life in Istanbul in the late 1920s, and then she went off to Izmir in the late 1920s and died there in 1948. But she was then suffering quite ill health. So she died very old. She was in her 90s. I know that Ahmed Robinson was a very devoted son to her. They lived together in Istanbul and in Izmir, and I think it was with deep regret that he had to go to the United States and leave her in 1929. But we don't know that much more about Hannah's life other than those instances. She was much more famous in the early 18th. Once she arrived in Istanbul, Hannah, the Fatima, Hannah of the English converts, she made a name for herself then, but then receded into the background as time went on.
Thank you for that, Gareth. Now we're being asked, and this came up, this was a theme before as well, whether any of the children of these women continue to practice Islam in any way. So while you're still there, Gareth, I imagine Ahmed and Abdul Rahman, they did? Is that right?
I guess that they did. I know also that they were sending Christmas cards to relatives in the UK, and Hannah as well. That was seen in the letters. But the Hermann Bernstein, I mentioned in my book, Hermann Bernstein was a famous author who interviewed Tolstoy, Trotsky, etc. He came to Istanbul in 1909 to interview the head of the religion there. There's number 2 below the Sultan, and it was Ahmed Robinson who escorted him around and was very familiar with all the customs, when to bow, how to introduce Hermann Bernstein to this religious dignitary. So clearly the sons were brought up as Muslims. The Robinson brothers were first of all brought up in a military school. That was another largesse of the Sultan. Mustafa Ziki Pasha, his officer, was in charge of military schools, and they had free education in the military schools, and then transferred to Galatasaray, which is a French language school. So they had quite a varied upbringing, right, and obviously got very much interested in sports as well. But yes, they were very much aware of religious practices and codes and conventions.
Right. And Dr. Sariya, you say you actually met some of the descendants of Lady Evelyn. Do you know if there's any Muslims in the family still?
So they're very. I think early on, her children, there was actually this, and her great grandson tells me about how they almost wanted to ignore her legacy. This wasn't something they wanted to talk about too much. But then with the latter generations, with the gentleman I spoke to, there was almost this innate pride around their eccentric ancestor who converted to Islam. And even when he showed me the brochure that was produced when they were selling Gleneagh recently. I think this was around 10 years ago when they were selling Gleneagh for, don't ask me how much it was sold for, crazy amounts of money. But even in that brochure, her history is mentioned. Now, so I have sort of tried to look into this as a convert myself. You know, I'm making sure my children are on the straight and narrow, whether they like it or not. I'll probably get banned for that. But no, I haven't found evidence. At one stage, you know, Lady Evelyn Cobbold is not very close to her children. There's this divorce with her you know, her husband that they aren't very happy about either. And they think, you know, this is her conversion to Islam is almost sort of a charade she's putting up to embarrass their father. But her grandson, Toby Sladen, is very close to her. He was largely brought up by her. And in, you know, when you look at the images of the gravestones, her grave, there's another grave next to her. And so even he chose to be buried next to her in the Highlands. But I haven't, you know, so he was probably sympathetic to Islam, but no evidence that he ever became Muslim. And same with
I
the
think
other
it's a
women
that we've noticed that with a lot of these convert families, it's very unusual for that legacy to continue. And I'm just going to bring in the Maulana just to ask if he's aware, because obviously he's looked into Fatima's life over there. So Maulana, are you aware of any descendants
of Fatima Elizabeth?
Yes.
So Halim, obviously, he was. I mean, after her death, Quilliam takes care of him. He is sent to a college where he does really well, and every year, I think 2 or 3 times in the Crescent, his marks come up as doing really, really well in mathematics, especially. And then, as they move over to London, there's a few mentions of him here and there. And this is the difficulty in terms of finding someone like Halim Hubert Henry Cates or Quilliam Cates, is that because research is fairly new, and when we look up into the archives, we have a lot of Hubert Cates out there. So it's about finding which one is the Halim Quilliam Cates. So that's where we're at the moment. But there is a mention of him having a daughter, which I just was passed on to me today by Brother Yahya Burt. So that's what we're going to try and follow, inshallah. Yeah.
Okay. We've still got. Yes.
Just to add that Ahmed Robinson was also heavily involved with the YMCA.
Right.
In Istanbul in the 1920s. And he was not just in a sporting capacity, but also acting as an intermediary between YMCA authorities and the Turkish authorities to try and set up various educational, social, cultural projects, both in Istanbul and in Izmir. So he's sort of playing that bridging role between East and West, Christianity and Islam.
Right. And of course, that's obviously because he can move between the two cultures quite fluidly, and that makes it easier for him. I've got a couple more to go through quickly. So we've got Molly here saying, I find it very interesting that Cates believed that marriage is a civil contract, which is very advanced in terms of contemporary problems of non-registration of nikah. Maulana, do you want to say anything about that?
So I think when it came to that column, I think at the time it was Maulana Rafiuddin who she may have consulted, because she mentions him as well in that. So and again, even when Esperanza responds to Fatima Elizabeth, she does say that there's an odor of legality in her response, and she doesn't go, and then she does kind of bring up the point of polygamy. But so when Fatima Elizabeth is writing, you've got to understand that it's in the early stages where she's consulting Quilliam and Maulana Rafiuddin as well. So in terms of Fatima Elizabeth's understanding of Islam, I think it was still developing at the time. So that's why she was also correcting herself in the following columns as well.
Of course. Well, thank you for that, Maulana. We are going to, we've got one more coming in. Where and how long, this is for you, Gareth, where and how long were the Robinson family in India? If you could be quick with that one.
The Spencer Robinson was in India from 1874 till his death in 1889, and Hannah went straight to India after their marriage in 1880 and brought up the family there.
Thank you. That was fantastically quick. Well, that's it, folks. But please don't log out just yet, as I have some final bits of information that I know you will appreciate. First of all, please remember, these talks will now be available as a resource for anyone that wants to use what we have learned to develop more decolonized material, educational resources, or if you just love the sound of our voices, you can go to the Everyday Muslim YouTube channel, where in the next week or so, every single one will be up as a recording. Over the past 4 weeks, our 6 episodes have mapped the Islamic presence from the 7th century right up to the present day, but focusing particularly on the period when our nation's very first real Muslim communities were established. Our topics have included new revelations about Britain's first Sheikh al-Islam, some coming today, Abdullah Quilliam, London's early Muslim activists, the Mecca of Europe, the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking, forgotten early Muslims, imperial soldiers, Lascars and Ayahs, and of course, Britain's First Muslimahs. Please don't forget, one of the ways you can actually connect with this heritage is by experiencing Britain's very first Muslim heritage trails set in Woking. These are self-guided trails you can download yourself and follow. And if we can have that last slide up, please, Mijambai. If, however, you are among those wanting to be guided, as we mentioned last week, around the highlights of these 2 trails, which include visiting the Mecca of Europe, the Shah Jahan Mosque, and the final resting places of Abdullah Quilliam, several of those early London activists, including the great Quran translator Marmaduke Pickthall, brave Muslim soldiers that died fighting for Britain, and some fascinating Muslimahs, including one of the last Ottoman princesses, then join us on Saturday, the 15th of August in Woking, when I will personally take you around and talk you through this fascinating heritage. The tour starts at 11 a.m. at the Shah Jahan Mosque and will end around 2 p.m. at Britain's first Muslim burial site in Brookwood. This will be a paid ticketed event. So for more information and to register interest, please email info@everydaymuslim.org, which is up on the screen. And for those of you still not comfortable meeting in groups, we are planning to host a virtual tour soon afterwards. If you are registered with Islamic courses, details of this will be sent out to you. Otherwise, you can follow either myself on Twitter at @_Tariq Hussein, or Everyday Muslim via @everyday_Muslim, which is on the screen there. All that is left now is for me to thank everyone one last time. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to our hosts, Islamic Courses, for recognizing the importance of this heritage and putting on the series. Thank you to Yahya Burt, who is out there somewhere, for helping to curate the series. Thank you to Everyday Muslim for all their support throughout. And of course, a huge thank you to all our guests today, Dr. Sariya, Gareth, and Maulana Hamid, for making this final episode such a brilliant one. It has been a real honor, privilege, and enlightening experience bringing this series to you all. And I sincerely hope it is the first of many more events that shine a light on what is ultimately Britain's heritage, albeit one that has long been neglected, but hopefully no more. Thank you again. Goodbye and salams.